Hello, my name is Selena Moon, and I am a visually impaired half Nisei. I'm delighted to be able to present my research to you during the Tadaima 2021 program. I began researching mixed-race Japanese American history in college after reading Jean Wakatsuki Houston's Farewell to Manzanar. My class was privileged to visit Manzanar during the 2007 annual pilgrimage. Several years later, in 2019, I visited Manzanar for the 50th annual pilgrimage and discovered some material on a class for disabled students at Manzanar, which sparked my interest in Japanese American disability history. There is not a lot of material on people with disabilities before World War II. One of the most well-known is Nobuteru Harry Sumida, who was born around 1871 to 2, the exact date is unknown, in New York. He was raised by Caucasian foster parents, and his biological parents are as yet unknown. He enlisted in the Navy and served in the Spanish-American War, which was in 1898. During a gunship battle, he was severely wounded in the leg, which left him permanently disabled. And here is a picture of Mr. Sumida taken by Ansel Adams sometime around 1942 to 5 at Manzanar. There are a few more records for disabled civilians, mostly deaf and blind students at the schools for the deaf and blind, majority on the West Coast of the United States. The first deaf Japanese American student to attend the then California School for the Deaf and Blind was Mary Matsuda, who was born in 1887 in Washington. Her family moved a few years later to California, where she began school. She had enrolled by 1898, which was a little bit late, as enrollment could be as early as around age 6. She left in June of 1907 without a diploma, and there are unfortunately no further records about her, so I was unable to trace her or her family further. The next several batch of students were together in the 1920s and especially 30s and 40s. The most well-known of those students is Kikui Ukai, who was born in 1903 and enrolled by 1920. She did graduate in 1928 and was perhaps the first Japanese American student at Gallaudet College, now university in Washington, D.C., the only liberal arts college for deaf and hard of hearing students in the United States. She attended Gallaudet from 1922 to 28, and she did leave. I don't believe she graduated. While at Gallaudet, she wrote for the Buff and Blue newspaper and the Silent Worker, the magazine at Gallaudet. After graduating or leaving, she wrote for this Shinsekai Asahi Shimbun and eventually had her own column called Literary Bypaths with Kikue Ukai in the 1930s, not too long after the newspaper opened. And there were many deaf, blind, and deaf-blind Japanese American students at schools across the United States, a few on the East Coast and in the Midwest. And I will note here that the term deaf with a lowercase d means the audiological condition of not being able to hear. Deaf with a capital D means culturally deaf, that is, a member of the deaf community, and I will continue to use the capital D deaf throughout this presentation. When Executive Order Dino 66 was issued, the WRA initially exempted certain groups of people, orphans, those who were totally deaf and blind, or institutionalized or severely disabled, especially if there would be some hardship in being moved from their institutions, or if there was severe difficulty in removing them from their institutions. However, by the time the actual incarceration occurred, most of those exemptions were no longer valid, and only severely disabled people were allowed to remain in various facilities. Anybody else, including physically disabled, mentally disabled, multiply disabled people, were incarcerated in the assembly centers and camps. There were a few exceptions, one of whom was Ran Hirano, who was a student at the California School for the Deaf, one of 11 at the time. And he stayed with a family while everyone else was incarcerated with their families in camps across the country, not just in California. Those who were exempted from the assembly centers were, for example, a young woman who had been in a car accident, so was in a body cast, and could not go to the assembly centers and could not leave the hospital until she was partially recovered. They immediately shipped her with crutches to straight to the incarceration camps. Other than that, even people in wheelchairs were sent to the assembly centers, though the assembly centers were a little bit better equipped to handle wheelchairs, incidentally, because there were ramps and there weren't any stairs up to the barracks, unlike at the incarceration camps. The exceptions were issued on March 30th, 1942, which was the day that roughly around the time that the Bainbridge Islanders were evacuated. So I'm not sure if they also had an exception for people who could not go to the camps, but there was an official exemption for Japanese Americans, patients in hospitals who were confined or too incapacitated, and again, inmates of orphanages and those who were totally deaf and blind. However, orphanages chose to go to Manzanar because they would have been the only Japanese Americans, and that would have, the caretakers believed, caused undue psychological hardship. And the incarceration made things tremendously difficult for people with disabilities. There were really no provisions to take care of them. And according to National Park Service records, there were about 2,000 people over 65 and 1,000 disabled or infirm people. And according to the rather incomplete National Archives records, I found 1,966 who were classified under the Aid to Dependent Children Blind Old Age Association, or what they called uncorrectable major defects. So that included anybody who was deaf, hard of hearing, partially sighted, mentally disabled, and a few other categories that I haven't quite figured out yet. I have to date identified 49 blind and visually impaired people, 60 deaf and hard of hearing individuals, one of whom was the white wife of a Japanese incarceree, about 100 physically, 45 mentally, and 10 multiply disabled people in the camps. That said, there may be some overlap, as camp records sometimes did not use names to identify individuals, and most of the names I've found through other means. So these numbers may be a little skewed, but I have not found the roughly 1,000 or so disabled people as of yet. So Kikue Ukai and her, by then she was married, her husband, Shuji Fuji, were sent to Santa Anita. There was a lot of concern by the WRA officials because Fuji had founded Doho, the anti-fascist newspaper. However, the couple was allowed to leave and they moved to New York, but their families remained in camp. And then Ronald Takagi, who was exempted and remained at the California School for the Deaf, lived with Delight Rice, a child of a deaf adult known as a coda. So both of her parents were deaf, but she was hearing and knew sign language. And Delight actually tried to help deaf students who had been scattered across the country with their families. She tried to convince the WRA to move the students back to California so that they could attend or continue attending California School for the Deaf. Unfortunately, that didn't all work out at all because the California School for the Deaf refused to take any of the students back. There were some very tragic cases of disabled people separated from their families. Taeko Hoshida, whose family was actually from Hawaii, and one of the few families who was incarcerated on the mainland from Hawaii, was mentally disabled, slightly physically disabled, I believe, and blind after a car accident when she was about a year old. That also injured her mother. Taeko was not allowed to accompany the family, so she was sent to an institution on another island before the family left. She died a few years later before the family went home due to staff neglect. And Toyoki Kurima was also blind and mentally disabled. He was about 30 when the family went to camp. He had never left home. All he knew was his family environment, as had Taeko. And he was also forcibly institutionalized. He died within a month. So that was just the beginning of many, many tragedies for people with disabilities and their families. So now on to the camps. So Manzanar was where Nobuteru Sumida, who was by then a widower, was sent. He was the subject of a newspaper article of the Manzanar Free Press in 1943 as the oldest Nisei, which is probably true. There were probably older Nisei, but some of them weren't incarcerated, which is probably a whole nother presentation I could get into. And so there are several pictures taken of him by Ansel Adams during this time. So that's nice to actually get those pictures, as no others exist as far as I'm aware. Also at Manzanar were Hana Takagi, who was about 14 when the incarceration occurred. She was one of the 10 Japanese American students who was incarcerated from the California School for the Deaf. There were also Choko and Tsuichi Hayashi, whose family had come from Washington. Choko was about 19 and had been attending classes in Washington. It might have been the Washington School for the Deaf. Tsuichi was deaf, but had been too young to attend school until the incarceration. So one of the elementary school students actually started teaching lip reading, speech, and to Hannah at least, and possibly Choko, typing around January of 1943. Up until then, so from roughly March of 42 to January 43, there had been absolutely no education for disabled students in any of the camps, no facilities provided for their education at all. Unfortunately, the classes were rather ineffectual. This was a time when oralism was preferred, sign language was frowned upon, and depending on the school, outright prohibited, because hearing people thought that it'd be better for deaf people to know how to speak and lip read to get around in the world. And also Hannah complained that the course material was at grade levels that were much below what she had been learning at the California School for the Deaf, which had allowed sign language. But after the three students started getting private tutoring, that elementary school teacher decided to look into teaching children with disabilities. At the same time, the War Relocation Authority had also started looking into how to educate children with disabilities because they hadn't been able to place the deaf, especially students, in any of the schools. They refused to take Japanese American students, so they couched it as, oh, we don't have any room anymore, or tried to charge prohibitive tuition, which none of the families could afford, or didn't even reply to requests to admit the students. So Manzanar was the first camp to have a class for disabled students, which opened in late April of 1943. All of the students, regardless of disability, were in the same class: physically disabled students, mentally disabled students, blind students, deaf students. And the teachers really weren't equipped handle the students, unfortunately. They did a little bit better in some of the other camps, which I will get to in a minute. This picture on the right is the WRA booklet of the classes for the physically handicapped, which was on display at Manzanar when I went in 2019. They actually had one of the buildings entirely dedicated to education. So it talked about Hannah and her disappointment with the school and the programs that they had, and some of the pictures that were taken during that time. Around the same time, Tule Lake also started looking at opening a class for disabled students, partly because of Delight Rice's efforts. So there were around 56 deaf incarcerees at Tule Lake in July 1943. Roughly 15 to 20 of those were school-age children. And so there were discussions opening the school in early 1943. So Hannah and her family actually decided to move there. And then Ruth, her older sister, was hard of hearing, was offered a job to help with the deaf students at the Tule Lake School, which opened in late May of 1943. The teacher there, Miss Perry, was actually a former teacher of mentally disabled students in New Jersey who had been recruited specifically to help these students at Tule Lake. And so when the students were setting up the school, Miss Perry asked what they should name it, and Hannah had read about Helen Keller and suggested naming it the Helen Keller School. And so Miss Perry suggested that Hannah write to Helen about the school, which she did. Unfortunately, Hannah's letter to Helen does not survive. I would very much like a copy of the letter. I would be very happy to find it. But what does survive is a roughly one-paragraph excerpt of the letter that was published in the Tule Lake newspaper, the Tulean Dispatch, several months later in August. And what also survives is a copy of Helen's letter to Hannah and the class, seen here, which was recently digitized with the Alabama Federation for the Blind, which I'm very grateful to actually have a copy here. Unfortunately, Helen's letter arrived too late, and by that point, the loyalty questionnaire had led to the Tule Lake camp being designated as a segregation center for those deemed quote unquote disloyal. And so the school was closing by the time the letter arrived, and everybody was leaving either to permanently leave the camps or go to other camps. And so the school didn't really get very far. And again, Hannah was very disappointed with the education here as well. And things didn't get much better for her for quite some time in that regard. And eventually all of the other camps established a school or some kind of a program for disabled students. Inclusivity varied. Some of them, for example, only really catered to children with cerebral palsy. Some of them didn't really have programs for disabled students because they were focusing on non-disabled students, so they didn't really have the provisions for them. So in many cases, children languished without an education for perhaps the full time that they were in camp, perhaps only part of the time as they were moving camps. So therefore, sometimes incarcerees took matters into their own hands. Blind incarcerees, including Aiko Kuroki, who had gone to the California School for the Blind, taught each other Braille. Of course, Sam Mihara has talked about his father and Tokinobu and his Braille board and how he taught Japanese Braille to incarcerees. And I was very surprised at the amount of articles published in the camp newspapers about all of these efforts, the sheer amount of notes that the WRA had on such programs. And actually the camp administration had what they called crippled children's clinics to help students with various physical disabilities, say somebody with hair lip or who had issues with a limp or something like that, and they could take them out. They would, or eye issues that could be corrected with surgery. They would take them out to nearby hospitals for surgery, and there were several articles about efforts to that extent. So that was surprising. But overall, welfare at the camp was not very good. There was a lot of lack of proper medical care, weren't enough facilities, weren't enough doctors, weren't enough nurses, racism by white staff, nursing staff, a lot of mistakes by white nursing staff that led to disability either at the time or later. Lack of sanitation led to polio, TB, German measles, which caused paralysis or later amputation or blindness or deafness, and all sorts of other issues that came up because of the living conditions. And what was also interesting was at the same time that the camp newspapers were reporting on the programs, they were also reporting on soldiers. They would have lists in various articles about here's how many who were wounded, here's how many who were killed in action. And then they had, for certain disabled soldiers, lengthy articles on their progress, where they were going to school now that they had been honorably discharged after serving and being injured, all sorts of records like that. And of course, WRA kept a lot of records, though I haven't quite got access to a lot of those. Unfortunately, I'm hoping to do that soon. After camp and after the war, many of the students did leave. Not all of them did leave camp. Some stayed until the war was over. Some of them went on to schools in different states. One student went off to the Utah School for the Deaf. Hannah Takagi and her family moved to Chicago, where she attended first the Alexander Graham Bell School for the Deaf, which prohibited sign language and used oralism, lip reading. And then she transferred to the Illinois School for the Deaf, which finally allowed her to use sign language. And another one of her CSD classmates also eventually joined her at the Illinois School for the Deaf. She graduated from there a few years after the war. He left after the war ended and returned to CSD. But for many, especially deaf students who had not had an education or a very poor one in the 3 years in camp, they were so far behind that many of them did not return to school. They just couldn't keep up with the education. They had missed so much that they didn't feel that they could return. And because of poor sanitation and so forth, some of the people didn't actually become disabled until after the incarceration. Eiichi Norihiro, as seen in this excerpt here, contracted TB in the camp, and so he had his leg amputated several years later. Many cases of deafness and blindness because of conditions in the camp that worsened after the war, and so on. Decades later, when the redress movement began, many of the people involved were disabled veterans, former incarcerees, families whose children had been disabled because of conditions in the camp, family who had disabled members who had a lot of difficulty in the camps. So Senator Daniel Inoue, who lost an arm in combat, and Congressman Matsui, who became hard of hearing in the camps, and his sister was actually born blind after his mother got German measles in the camps, though he does not attribute either of those disabilities to conditions in the camp. And Sparku Matsunaga, who was also disabled in combat, were some of the senators and congressmen who sponsored the bill. Senator Mineta was the only non-disabled person involved. He actually got involved in the disability rights movement with the others, which I will talk about at the very end here. But all of these congressmen had seen firsthand what the incarceration had done, and most of them knew how difficult it was, especially for people with disabilities. And so when the testimony occurred, Hannah was asked to testify on behalf of disabled children. So she discussed mostly deaf children. There is a rather dearth of information about children with other disabilities, lack of records, and many of them have not done interviews, that they're only through the interviews of relatives and so forth. Mabel Olta did testify about her daughter Madeline, who was born mentally disabled because there weren't enough doctors when Mabel was giving birth. And so Madeline had oxygen deprivation and was mentally disabled as a result. Dr. Yoshie Togasaki testified about the conditions of the camp that caused a lot of sickness, disability, and other conditions. And her niece Sachiko, who was mentally disabled, and the inadequate facilities at the camps. And after the redress movement, even before, actually, beginning in the 1970s, there were deaf incarcerees who were interviewed by Professor Arthur Hansen, who had the foresight to do this, about their experiences. And especially after the redress movement, after the Civil Liberties Act passed, many began telling their stories. Most of the deaf incarcerees, Ernest Ikeda, Hannah, Nancy, Ernest's sister, and others, discussed their experiences and the hardships that they all faced. But again, there's a lack of experiences for many others, many with physical disabilities, mental disabilities, multiply disabled people, that I'm hoping to uncover. So here are some pictures of the redress movement. On the left is Mabel Ota, and in the middle is Hannah Takagi, and here's an excerpt of her testimony, which she had read by Attorney Gerald Sato. She chose not to sign and have an interpreter at the time. And then Dr. Yoshie Togasaki on the left during her during the hearings. And as a final aside, there were actually many Japanese Americans involved in the Americans with Disabilities movement. Congressman Matsui, Senators Daniel Ino and Spark Matsunaga, and Norman Mineta actually got involved in the disability movement because a friend of his suggested that he go around his office and environs in a wheelchair to see how accessible it was. And of course, he found that it was not. So all of these senators and congressmen co-sponsored or were otherwise involved in the ADA in the 1980s. And actually, Justin Dart, who was known as the father of the ADA, who lobbied all 50 states, lobbied congressmen and so many people, who was actually in a wheelchair, who contracted polio as a child, married Yoshiko Saji when the two met in Japan. And so the two of them were very, very involved in the disability rights movement. And Yoshiko took many of the pictures, which I will talk about in just a second. And Michael Winter married Atsuko Kuwana. Both of them were in wheelchairs. Atsuko, after receiving a spinal injury at birth. The two met when Atsuko came to the United States to study as a college student. And so here on the bottom left is Michael Winter, and he is actually at the top of the Capitol steps during what was called the Capitol Crawl after the ADA didn't pass the House. Activists in wheelchairs got to the bottom of the Capitol steps and crawled up the steps to show how inaccessible it was. And the little girl next to him is Jennifer Keelan, who was then 8 years old, who was the youngest participant, who also climbed the steps. And so this picture was taken by Tom Olin, who has taken many, many pictures of the disability rights movement. In the middle here is a picture of Atsuko Kuwana and other activists on the lawn of the White House when the ADA was signed in 1990. So Atsuko is in the wheelchair in the front with Senator Ted Kennedy behind her. And that photo was actually taken by Yoshiko Dart. And of course, this on the right is the famous picture of President Bush signing the ADA. And the gentleman in the wheelchair on his right, in the cowboy hat, is Justin Dart. And that picture was taken by Mr. Tom Olin. I received this courtesy of Yoshiko Dart, and President Bush has signed the picture for Justin. There are actually several publications relating to people with disabilities in the camps. Ron Hirano actually wrote The Life Story of Mother Delight Rice and Her Children about Delight Rice, who he stayed with during the war, and her efforts to educate mostly deaf children in the Philippines and in the US in several states. And he, as of 2013, is working on an autobiography, which I'm hoping he will publish soon. Hannah Takagi Holmes has been included in several books. Her longest biography to date is included in Too Long Been Silent, and there are excerpts of her interviews with Arthur Hansen in Telling Deaf Lives. George Ntama Hoshida, who had been incarcerated on the mainland from Hawaii, wrote Taken from Paradise Isle, the Hoshida family story. And I am actually working on several books at the moment, both on Japanese American mixed race history and disability history. I have an adult book on each of those topics in the works. I'm planning 2 middle grade books, one about mixed race history or mixed race children, and one about children with disabilities in the camps. I'm hoping to get to the archives to finish a lot of that work. And I am also working on a picture book about Hannah, which I am hoping to query and get published in 2023, the anniversary of these first schools opening in the camps. Thank you very, very much for joining me on this presentation. I would love to hear from you if anybody would like to share stories or has any further information. I'd love to hear from you. My email is Selena, SELENA .M as in Mary, and then another dot, and then moon @gmail.com. And I can also be reached at Twitter at Selena M Moon. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.